Hi guys, we're going to talk about chapter 16 today. This is the evidence for evolution. I'm going to post this for you guys on Blackboard, that way you can watch it and then we'll have some more time in class. Okay, so one of the cool things about evolution is it just shows all of the different types of animals and how they've kind of evolved and been selected naturally in their environments to have more advantageous traits, and how those populations have kind of shifted and changed over time. So dinosaur fossils, which are probably the ones you guys are most familiar with, what archaeologists found is that they exist beneath what's called the KPG layer, which is just a layer of sediment, and they do not exist above that KPG layer. So again, that's just a layer of sediment in the ground. And so what that tells us is that after that KPG layer was formed, dinosaurs were gone because there were no more fossils. So you guys have all heard of the giant meteorite that hit the planet, kicked up a lot of dirt and crap into the atmosphere, and it like choked out all the plants, and it gave rise to that mass extinction that killed all the dinosaurs. And so there was that giant impact crater down at the very bottom part of Mexico in that Yucatan Peninsula, which dates about 66 million years ago. And so this was that big impact that a lot of people think is what actually killed the dinosaurs and caused that huge mass extinction. So there were a lot of people that had ideas about evolution and how organisms change and shift over time. And one of the first people to talk about that was Aristotle. And so about 2,300 years ago, he described nature as a continuum of organization from lifeless matter through complex plants and animals. And so everything was included in his idea, down from like the dirt and the water and the mountains all the way up to humans. And in the 1300s, there were Europeans that believed in what was called a great chain of being, which extended from the lowest forms of humans to spiritual beings. And so now we've kind of come out and over this thing, and now we're talking about supernatural stuff like angels and gods and things like that. So there was no room for need or change in this theory because there was, again, the supernatural kind of involved here. And so a lot of people in that time just kind of like quit thinking about evolution, and a lot of that religious dogma kind of started getting in there, where people started to think it was actually kind of like anti-Christian and against the church to believe that species could spring up out of not nowhere, but they could spring up without the intervention of like a deity or a celestial being. So in the 1800s, people started exploring different continents, and so one of the most famous ones, of course, is Charles Darwin. And so there was naturalists that were traveling around the globe. They were finding new species of plants and animals, and then they were bringing back samples so that everybody could see them. And these people were kind of known as the pioneers of biogeography, which is just the study of how life and geography kind of mesh together. These people saw patterns in these species. So where they lived, they had similar body patterns and similar species that were isolated from each other, either by an ocean or from like a big geographic thing like a mountain range. But they were noticing that these animals were very similar to each other. The Galapagos turtles, for example, and the tortoises there, you find tortoises all over the planet, and they are very similar, but you find them in very different places. And so this is kind of what started people thinking, like, well, maybe there's more to these similar species than just them being separate species. They were founded completely separately of one another. Maybe they came from maybe a common ancestor. And so again, this kind of started the ball rolling, thinking about where all these animals could have come from. So here's just an example. So you've got these organisms that are very similar to each other. You guys can see this, like this emu. Those are native to Australia, which you guys know is its own continent. It's like way down, surrounded by ocean. There's a rhea that's native to South America, and so you guys know where South America is. You can kind of tell. And then an ostrich that is native to Africa. So all of these things are on different continents. They're all separated by a huge ocean, but yet these animals are very similar. And so again, these pioneers of that biogeography kind of started thinking that maybe these guys came from a common ancestor, and maybe there was some sort of speciation event that separated them out after a while. And we'll talk about that more here in a second. This is another example, just a plant example of organisms that are very similar to one another, but they're found on different continents. And so these guys over here, they look very similar to these guys over here, but in fact they're not really related at all. These are euphorbs that you find in Africa, and these are cacti that you find in the American Southwest. And so again, very similar features, but they're on different continents separated by huge oceans. So how did they get that way? So one of the things that these early scientists used was something called comparative morphology to study how related organisms were, because at this point they didn't have like DNA evidence, they didn't have like genome blasting studies and things like that that they could use to kind of uncover how related species were. What they had was looking at body shapes, and so looking at anatomical patterns and looking at how visibly things look similar to one another. And so comparative morphology is just the study and the comparing of organisms based on their body systems. So we can use anatomical patterns for this. So like, how do the skeletons line up? What do these organisms look like? Do they all have beaks? Do they all have a hard skeleton? Do they all have an exoskeleton? You can look at similarities and differences among body plans. How are those skeletal bones organized? Like, are they used for flight? Are they used for running? Are they used for swimming? And then also, this revealed body parts that have no apparent function. So they're what we call now vestigial structures that don't really have a purpose. Like, you guys have a tailbone because our ancestors used to have tails, and so we've still got those vestigial remnants of our ancestors that are kind of slowly going away. You don't really have a tail anymore, but you do have the remnants of those bones. You can also look at fossils, and so a lot of what these guys had, like back in the 1800s, was they had fossil records they could look at. This is when people started digging these things up and really starting to like study them and see what they were. So some of the questions that are raised by fossils include, like, why were identical sequences of rock formations found in different parts of the world? How is that even possible? So some of these naturalists, while they were traveling around the planet, found that there were identical like sedimentary rock sequences in like Africa and Asia. How is that possible? It's not really something that you would think of if you had these two places that were separated by these huge oceans and many thousands of miles, that at the exact same time and exactly the same process you get these sedimentary rocks that are exactly the same. And so that's one of the things that these naturalists were wondering about. Then also, why did these deep layers of rock reveal simpler life forms than the more recent layers? This is partially something called the law of seriation. That which is deeper is older. And so what they started noticing is, like, the deeper down they went, the fossils they were pulling up were much more simple organisms like trilobites, and they had exoskeletons, more like bug-like invertebrate kind of creatures. And as you get closer up towards the surface, the newer layers of rock, you had more complex organisms. So why is that? That's what they were starting to think to themselves. So with discoveries in all of these different areas, in your biogeography, your comparative morphology, and your geology, this didn't fit with what like Aristotle and some of the early Europeans were kind of thinking, because they all thought that species kind of remained constant over time. And that makes sense. I mean, if you think about it, humans are only alive for 80 years, something like that on average, and so you're not going to see the changing of species over time. And way back when, they weren't really looking at fossils, they weren't really looking at comparative anatomy, and so of course they were thinking that species were just kind of the same over time, because we've always been, we always were, why would we change? Turns out that's not true at all. So there's your tailbone that I was telling you about. So you can see, like, that's your vestigial, it's called your coccyx. It's actually made of 4 separate fused vertebral bones, or coccygeal bones, and we don't really use those. In other mammals that do have tails, there are more vertebral bones there, and they are actually used for tails, so for locomotion and things like that. We don't use them for that reason anymore. All right. So Georges Cuvier, around 1800, kind of had this idea that species that were once, or that had once existed, were now extinct, meaning that you've got this whole group of organisms, this whole clade of organisms, possibly, if you can stretch it out that far, that used to exist, but now we don't have representatives of them anymore. And so this is one of the things that we look at with fossils. You can look at these bone structures and realize, like, we don't have anything like that anymore. I can't think of any organisms on the planet that look like that. There's nothing really that's this big or that has this kind of bone structure. And so George Cuvier thought about this, and he was like, wow, so there must have been species that used to be, and they are not anymore. And he also realized that Earth's surface had changed, because you find sea fossils near mountaintops. Now, I've heard some people say that, like, there was the big flood, or like if you have that religious mythology or whatever it is that you have been reading about in your classes or in your church or whatever, I've had it explained to me that sea fossils were found near mountaintops because of the flood. But the flood only lasted for 40 days and 40 nights. And so if you're thinking of it that way, that would be not a super huge long time for these organisms to like make it all the way up to like the top of Mount Everest. A more reasonable explanation for that is that you have mountains that are actually coming up because of plate tectonics, when the two plates smash into each other and they kind of force all of that matter upwards. So now what you've got is what used to be the sea floor is now on top of a mountain. And so that was part of what George Cuvier was thinking about. And so these catastrophic geologic forces must have shaped the Earth in the past as well, not just currently. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, he's the one that postulated that species gradually change over time. And so this is actually one of the founding like rock or like bedrock ideas of natural selection, is that you've got your species that are gradually changing over time, and gradually they improve over time as well, because as time goes on, the more fit organisms are going to survive. Those that have the best genes and the best traits are the ones that are going to survive over time. And so over the course of evolutionary time, populations are going to shift and change based on who gets to mate and who gets to pass their genes on to the next generation. And so there's environmental pressure that causes requirements for change. So again, I think we talked about this in class a little bit before, that it's imperative that there is uniqueness and that there is a little bit of variability in your populations, because if you have that little bit of uniqueness and that little bit of diversity in your population, if something happens like an ecological disaster, you as a population are much more likely to survive that ecological disaster, because not everybody is the same. And so there is environmental pressure constantly working all the time on all organisms, and these pressures make it a requirement that organisms must change. If they don't change, then they die in the face of something new. So Charles Darwin, I'm sure you guys have heard of this guy. When he was 23 years old, can you imagine? Oh my gosh, he was so young. He got on board a little tiny boat called the HMS Beagle, and he joined a survey expedition and traveled around the globe. He became a naturalist, and he took very good notes, and he took lots of samples from all the different places that he visited, and all of these things and all of these similarities and looking at all these organisms just, kind of got him thinking about descent with modification. So looking at all of his fossils, looking at all of his biogeographical stuff, looking at all of his notes from all of his contemporaries, just kind of got him, got the wheels turning for this idea of descent with modification, and eventually his idea of natural selection. So at this point in history, most people thought that the Earth was 6,000 years old, and this comes from a biblical reference, and they thought that the Earth was 6,000 years old. Charles Darwin, looking at all these fossils and looking at all this stuff that was happening, was kind of like, I don't know about that, and so he challenged this idea, which was a really big deal in the 1800s, because it was kind of church and state, and like the church and state were kind of one, and so he could have gotten in a lot of trouble for this. So Darwin collected lots and lots and lots of stuff while he was voyaging around on that HMS Beagle. He had a contemporary, so somebody that was one of his peers, named Thomas Malthus, and he correlated that there were increases and decreases with the human population size, with famines, disease, and war. And so that was something that he saw just, in his own lifetime, that there was these population changes because of environmental pressures. And so that was something that he was thinking about. And so Darwin theorized that all these populations have the capability to reproduce beyond the environment's capacity to support. This is a really important theorem in biology. It's something called carrying capacity, and we'll talk about that more when we get to ecology, but the environment can only support a certain number of individuals of a population. So whether that's bears or humans or blades of grass or plants or whatever, there's only as many resources as can be sustained by a certain number of organisms. And so Darwin theorized that populations have the capability to reproduce beyond that carrying capacity. And so, again, we'll talk about that a little bit later in the semester, but this was a big deal for him to start thinking about this now. So Darwin also understood about selective breeding, okay, because in the 1800s, I mean, obviously horse breeding, dog breeding, pigeon breeding for like roller pigeons and for passenger pigeons and carrier pigeons and things was a thing. And so you could actually breed organisms together to produce varied traits that were looked for in humans. Like I think in the royal family, corgis and like there were a lot of little lap dogs and things, like, and especially like hunting dogs that people would breed for specific traits. And so this is an idea that's actually called artificial selection. Artificial selection is when you have a human choosing who mates with who so that you can breed in desired traits. And dogs are a really good example of this because all dogs are the same species, but they all look so different because we've bred them selectively for certain traits. Like we breed Great Danes to be huge and have like the big floppy ears, and we breed beagles to be a certain size and coat pattern, and they're really good at smelling and hunting. They're good hunting animals. We breed Australian shepherds to be good shepherd dogs. We breed dachshunds to be like the little short low rider legs, and they're also good for hunting. And so we've done that artificially because we are the ones that are selecting who gets to breed with who. And so that's just kind of the other side of the coin with natural selection. And so Darwin knew that you could produce a selected organism with selected traits based on this selective breeding or this artificial selection. He also realized that in the natural environment, you could also have pressures that would select for certain forms and certain traits to make a population that was more suited to it. A good example of this is counter shading in like sharks and other big like predatory organisms and even prey organisms in the ocean. If you've ever looked at like a killer whale, for example, they're dark on top, light on the bottom. That's because if you are looking bird's eye down at the water, seeing dark on a dark water surface is a lot more difficult to see than like white on a dark water surface. And also, if you're underneath the organism and you're looking up against like a backlit sky, seeing a white belly on like a backlit sky is going to be more difficult to see than a dark belly on a backlit sky. And so a lot of marine organisms especially have that counter shading, and that's because in those environments that type of coat coloration or skin coloration is advantageous to stay away and become less apparent to predators. So that would be called an adaptive trait. And an adaptive trait is just a heritable trait that enhances an individual's fitness, and so their ability to breed, not get eaten, to find food, so have you. So that's what the heritable traits are. They're adaptive, and they are good for that organism in that place at that time. And so natural selection just states that over time, individuals with adaptive traits tend to survive longer and reproduce more than their less fit rivals. So this is where survival of the fittest comes in. And so this is the mechanism by which evolution occurs. Natural selection is evolution on a very, very short time scale. So this is working on a population level. And so over the course of evolutionary time, over the course of thousands or millions or eons, those changes, those additive changes are going to become really big changes and possibly even give rise to new species. So Sir Alfred Wallace wrote an essay and sent it to Darwin, and he outlined evolution by natural selection. And so natural selection, you guys have probably heard more about Darwin than you have Wallace. Darwin actually got his theory of natural selection and his theory of evolution published first, but technically Darwin and Wallace kind of had the same idea at the same time, so we're trying to give credit where credit is due at this point and give them both a little bit of credit. Okay, so here's some principles of natural selection. I'll let you guys read those on your own. So now we're going to talk a little bit about fossils and like how they're formed, what they mean, and what they do for us as far as like the scientific community. So fossils generally have to consist of things that were hard in life, and so like mineralized bones, teeth, shells, seeds, other hard body parts. It's really difficult to find fossils of like sharks and stuff because sharks are made out of cartilage, which is kind of a soft tissue, and so it'll degrade before it has a chance to harden And so usually you only find fossils of shark jaws because that's the only part of their body that's made out of bone. So generally speaking, if it's hard stuff, that's gonna make a really good fossil. And so trace fossils include things like footprints, burrows, trails, eggshells, and then feces. Feces that's been fossilized is called coprolite, if you guys were wondering. That's a little bit of cocktail knowledge. You can go impress your friends with that tomorrow. Okay, so the fossilization process, generally speaking, is that you've got an organism that's either died or is covered up by sediment, mud, or ash. Groundwater is going to fill in those spaces where the remains were. Dissolved minerals in the water is going to replace those minerals in the bone. And then there's going to be pressure exerted on that space. And so that extreme pressure is going to transform those minerals into rocks, which is where you get your fossils from. So we've discovered over 250,000 fossils for known species, and that's just the start. I mean, there are lots of organisms, I'm sure, that never had fossils produced of them just because they were growing in places where maybe that wasn't possible, or maybe we just haven't found them yet. And so I'm sure that there are just like millions and millions and millions more organisms that probably existed. Just because we didn't have the fossil record does not mean that they didn't exist. And so fossils tend to be relatively rare because the organism that created the fossil had to fossilize before it decomposed or was eaten by another predator or scavenger or something like that. So as you can imagine, probably not the case for most organisms. And so some of these organisms, like I was talking about before, were made mostly of soft parts, and so there was not very much to fossilize once they died. Like sharks are a good example of that because their bodies are made out of cartilage, and the only part of them that's not made of cartilage is their teeth and their jaws. And so there were probably organisms way back when that maybe had 100% cartilage skeletons. I don't know. And so those ones would have had a really difficult time fossilizing just because their body parts were very soft. So here's some, this is a trilobite, this little guy right here. So this was an invertebrate species that lived a really long time ago, and there's lots of species, or lots of fossils of trilobites, which are really cool. And so these are types of sedimentary rock where you can go in there and you can like get in between the layers and you can find fossils. So we're able to date fossils using some sort of radiometric dating, and so there are radioisotopes. And if you guys remember from the lecture that we had way in the beginning, an isotope is just a form of an element that is different from the one that you find most often in the environment. And so you also have radioisotopes, which are radioactive, and so they decay or they fall apart at a constant rate. And so you can actually look at how much of a certain like carbon-14 or argon or something like that that's inside of a fossil, inside of the rocks. And since we know what the half-life is, based on how big the organism is and how big the fossil sample is, we can look at how much of that carbon-14 is left, we can look at how much of that argon is left, and then we can extrapolate how old that organism is based on what radioactive isotopes you have that are, or the amount of radioactive isotope that you have left in that fossil. And so this shows you like the decay of, or like the half-life of an isotope. And so I don't know what isotope this is. This is just a graph that would show you. So if you have 100% of the parent isotope remaining, then that means this is not a super old specimen. However, if you have 50% left, this would be one half-life. And then after 2 half-lives, you'd only have half of that. And after 3 half-lives, you would only have half of that. And so that's how they're able to kind of like look at that decay line, and they're able to extrapolate how old an organism would be based on what the half-life of this specific radioisotope they're looking at that's in the fossil. So in the age of volcanic rock, or so finding age in volcanic rock, magma, which is like your lava, as it cools, it crystallizes and hardens into rock. I'm sure you guys are all familiar with that. So each of these minerals has a characteristic structure and composition. So the examples they give in your book is like uranium and zircon. So zircon crystals contain some uranium atoms, but no lead atoms. So when they're formed, there is no lead involved here. Uranium atoms eventually decay into lead given enough time. And again, scientists know what those timetables look like, and so they're able to use that information to mathematically extrapolate how old something would be based on the amount of either decay or how much, in this case, there would be lead left in the the samples. So the ratio of uranium atoms to the lead atoms can be precisely measured, again, because we know exactly how long it takes for uranium to decay into lead. And then you can calculate how long ago that crystal was formed. And so you can actually look at the rocks that are around the fossil too, sometimes to look and see how old that little puppy is. So this is an example of a nautilus using carbon-14 dating. And so what you've got here is this nautilus. These are really interesting organisms. They're cephalopods, and so they're related to squids and octopi. And so when this guy died, it had a certain number of carbon-14 in it, okay? So it died, it was covered up, and so it's got a bunch of carbon-14 in it, and we know what the decay rate is for carbon-14. So when you dig up this fossil, looking at how much is left is going to give you an idea of how old that little guy is. And so this one, because it says that 3 half-lives of carbon-14 have passed, that means this little guy is 17,190 years old, which is very cool. So fossils also help us fill in missing links in understanding how new species evolved. We're going to talk about modern cetaceans here in a second. So fossils, they can kind of illustrate how these gradual changes in skeletal features and in anatomical features led to a very big change over time. So this little guy, this Elamerix right here, this is what we believe is to be the ancient common ancestor for cetaceans. And cetaceans are like whale-like organisms that live in the water. They're modern organisms that you can see today. So these little guys were small terrestrial organisms that lived about 30 million years ago, okay? One of the cool things about them is we know that their ankle bones have got these really interesting shapes in them. And so we use that comparative morphology of their leg and their leg bones to kind of look and see later. So we've got this little guy. So this is an ancient whale that lived a long time ago, and this guy has also got that like double pulley shape of their ankle bone right here. And so this is what the scientists were using to kind of compare these different skeletons, because this is a very unique feature, and so it's not very likely that these organisms just developed this incredibly unique feature on their own. It's more likely that they're derived from a common ancestor. And so in our modern whales, if you look at their skeletons here, like you can see that this little guy also had this really unique kind of leg bone feature in its skeleton, but this is so small that this probably didn't or was not able to support the weight of this big guy right here. And so you can postulate that this organism probably had to be fully aquatic or fully marine, like it had to be in the water, because these little back legs could not support the weight of this huge organism. And so in our modern cetaceans, like this is a sperm whale skeleton right here, it's also got the remnants of those really interesting pelvic and leg bones, but there's no ankle bones anymore. And so you can see like these vestigial, or these no longer needed structures, are kind of slowly going away over evolutionary time. So the biogeography gets kind of interesting here. So we've got, you guys are probably aware now that we have drifting continents and the seas change. And so Pangaea, way back in the day, was a supercontinent. So this is when all of the plates that now make up the 7 continents were all kind of like smushed together. And so as Pangaea split up into fragments, it drifted apart. And so this was originally known as continental drift. And the plates are still moving. They're just not moving super fast. I don't remember what the exact measurement was, but I think they only move like a couple inches a year, something like that. So not a ton. And it's going to take a really long time for them to smash into each other again. So there is a lot of evidence for this continental drift, because you find the same types of rocks and the same types of rock formations that exist on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. Okay, the Atlantic Ocean is huge, and so it seems very unlikely that these rock formations that are identical would have formed at the same time on opposite sides of the ocean. It's much more likely that those rock formations formed at the same time in the same place on Pangaea, and then they were split apart and then they drifted apart over evolutionary time. That's a much more sound and cogent argument than they were both made separately but exactly the same at exactly the same time. So South America and Africa like fit together like puzzle pieces. They really do. If you look at the east coast of South America and you look at the west coast of Africa, they would like fit together just like puzzle pieces. Oh, excuse me. So with our plate tectonics theory, this just kind of says that Earth's outer layer cracked into these huge immense plates, which are now our continental plates. And then magma, lava welling up under the sea, pushed those old rocks to the opposite edge, like into this new trench. And those movements transported continents to their new location. And if you guys ever get to take a geography class, you'll get to learn more about this. Super, super, super interesting. And it says that these plates move about 4 inches per year. Sorry about that. I think I said that they move 2 inches per year, but it's not very much. And so you're not going to notice that movement over the course of your lifetime. So this is in the United States. This is the San Andreas Fault. And so this is where those continents are starting to like come apart again. And so this is a big subduction zone. So you can kind of see like here's fault number 1, and then you can see like as the land mass like bumps into one another, basically they get pushed down, and so that's that subduction zone right there. So those supercontinents formed and split up about 5 times since Earth was formed, and so that means that this process takes a really, really, really long time. The supercontinent that existed before Pangaea was called Gondwana. So transition between those layers in the sedimentary rock mark boundaries over time. So each layer's composition is going to offer clues about the environment at that time, because you can look at those layers and you can pull out how much carbon was in the atmosphere, how much salt was in the ocean, you can look at the elements that are in those layers, and it can give you clues about what the atmosphere was like, what the ocean was like. Were we underwater? Was this a terrestrial landscape? We're not sure. And so fossils record the life at that time. This is just kind of shows you guys like all the different extinction events and like all these different periods in the Earth's history, and so you guys can look at this and read about like what the atmosphere looked like where the tropics were, like all this other good stuff if you want to. I think this is really, really interesting. So I think right now we're in the Holocene right now. So this is modern humans evolving, major extinction events is now underway, and so you can see like there were major extinction events 5 other times in the Earth's history, and this is again denoted by fossils, and right now we're in the 6th major extinction event. And that is largely caused by humans, which is really sad. If you go to the Grand Canyon, which is where this is, you can actually look and see like all the different colors and all the different layers of all the rocks here. And if you want to, over here, you can kind of see what all of that means, and so what was alive at those times in those areas. All right, so these are your points to ponder. I hope you guys enjoyed this, and I will see you next week.